We just received this morning word that of the 7 agencies in the federal government asked to help the district with establishing and working towards charter schools, only 2 have responded. We need a lot more response and help from the federal government and the federal agencies. On the issue of school choice, I'm a co-sponsor of legislation, that's Senate Bill 847, and we'll hear about companion legislation from the House shortly, that would provide scholarships to low-income students who choose to get a quality education at a private school. Every child has a right to quality education. If they're being denied that right in their public school, they must be given the option to make sure they receive the quality education they deserve. That is a fundamental and a paramount right. If people are to be able to experience the fullness of education and be able to make the most of themselves, they need to have access to a quality education. A bureaucracy may be able to wait years for its improvement to take place, but a child, however, cannot. They have to receive that quality education when they're in the school system. In 2 years, first and second graders learn their basics of reading and mathematics. We can't put off learning basic reading and mathematics schools for that child. Senate Bill 847 would provide an immediate option to maintain these learning standards for children during the 2 years of improvement. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses that are coming to testify in front of the hearing, and I just want to say as well as I conclude my opening remarks, I'm very concerned about where we are on the District of Columbia public education. In the reconciliation bill that just went through Congress, we did a lot on improving the District of Columbia. We addressed the tax issue, put in 0 capital gains for property held for 5 years, first-time home buyers. There's been a lot done on the crime issue in the District of Columbia. I think there's more that needs to take place. We addressed the management issue in the District of Columbia. A lot of consternation and concern, but there are a lot of needs to manage better in the District of Columbia. I think some of the fundamentals are being addressed of crime, of growth, but the one that we haven't adequately addressed yet, and clearly haven't addressed yet adequately, is education, public education. And that's my deep concern and commitment that we need to move forward for the D.C. public schools for the children. They just aren't getting the chances for the quality education that they need to have. And that's what we want to examine at this hearing, and I have a number of questions for our witnesses and particularly for General Beckton in running those schools. Our first panel and first witness is the Majority Leader of the United States House of Representatives, who has been following and working on this issue for some period of time, and I'm delighted to have Dick Armey, Representative Armey, here to testify. And Representative Armey, thank you for coming over to this side of the Hill and testifying. I look forward to your presentation and a few questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I appreciate the fact that you're holding these hearings. I want to especially thank you for the opportunity to talk about the question of education in the city of D.C. As you know, I am the sponsor of school choice legislation for D.C. That'll soon be taken up in our own body in the appropriations process. I have long been a supporter of the concept of choice for families in the education of their children. But I have to tell you, this current effort that I'm working on has brought me into closer contact with the real families and the real children that I've been in other efforts. And you're absolutely right when you put the emphasis as you do on the children. And one of the things that I have learned in the last few days is Washington, D.C. is a city full of beautiful children. And every one of these children have a once-in-a-lifetime period in which they should and must get their education. And it's so critical that we understand for each individual child, it is now. And as George Allen, a person that we in Dallas don't always quote, I mean the coach George Allen used to say, the future is now, and never is that more true than you look into the face of a beautiful child looking for their chance to get through the 3rd grade this year, because they know that this is their year to do so. And I would like to talk about that in some of these more personal terms. Without naming any names, I want to tell a true story about an African-American family living in Anacostia. Through the generosity of some anonymous donors, 6 children in this family began attending a Catholic school in the District of Columbia last week. Up until now, they have attended the city's public schools, and if they were still attending the city's public schools, they would not have been in school last week. The oldest child is 13 and should be starting his freshman year in high school. Instead, he's starting the 7th grade. He is tested at the Catholic school and is actually only reading at about a 5th grade level. At 13 years old, this young man is already 4 years behind in school and on the verge of being a lifetime behind. The next child is a 10-year-old girl. Although she tested half a grade level behind, the principal at the school agreed not to hold her back. Last week, she began the 5th grade. Also attending the Catholic school is a friendly 9-year-old boy. Until a few volunteers took him under their wing 6 months ago, this boy could not read. Halfway through the 3rd grade in D.C. public schools, he could barely read a word on a page. Because of the volunteer help, 2 or 3 days a week over the past 6 months, his reading level has improved to the 2nd grade level. Even though he should be attending the 4th grade, he will be repeating the 3rd grade. The principal only agreed to hold him back just 1 grade when provided with a firm commitment that the intensive tutoring would continue. And I must say, I know the child, and I know the tutors, and I know that they made a commitment that has been convincing to this principal. Joining the young boy in the 3rd grade will be his very bright 8-year-old sister, the only one of the 6 children who did not test behind. Also attending the school will be a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old. I want to take, if you will, I'd like to take a moment to talk about the future of these children. The young man repeating the 3rd grade is an extremely kind and friendly child. But will his future look like that if he continues to go to school and continues to fall behind? He would grow older and fall further and further behind. He would become bored in class and begin to disturb the other students. His self-esteem would deteriorate, and eventually he would conclude that he can't compete in school. Unable to read, he would drop out. In today's economy, what future would the young man have? Fortunately, these 6 children are now attending a school that has an excellent record of success. Most of the students who graduate this elementary school go on to succeed in a private high school, and from there, most go on to college. Their new school is already producing results. Attitudes have changed, both among the children and their parents. The children are more excited to learn, and their parents are more engaged in the children's education. Because of the opportunity they have been given, these precious children are now going to become something more than just statistics. Mr. Chairman, some people may listen to me and complain that I am guilty of argument by anecdote. Let's look at the facts and see if the family that I've just discussed is representative of what's really happening in our nation's capital. In the family I mentioned, of the 4 children who are beyond kindergarten age, 3 or 4 test below grade level. According to the Washington Post, among D.C. public students as a whole, 65% test below their grade level. In 1974, 72% of 4th graders in D.C. public schools tested below basic proficiency on the National Assessment of Education Progress. Even many students who graduate have little to show for their diploma. 85% of D.C. public school students who enter the University of the District of Columbia need 2 years of remedial education before beginning their coursework towards their degree. A majority of public school graduates who take the U.S. Armed Forces qualification test fail it. What's worse, about 40% of the district children who enter the public schools never graduate at all. Unable to compete in our economy, many end up on welfare or in prison. A report released in August showed that at any given time, virtually half of all black men in Washington, D.C., aged 18 to 35, are either incarcerated, on parole, or probation, awaiting trial or being sought on an arrest warrant. We simply cannot continue to allow our young people to become nothing other than grim statistics. I have supported efforts to improve the public schools in the districts. I have met with General Beckton, and I believe he is committed to a genuine reforming and improving of the public schools. I support the strong charter school law created by Congress, which allows for creative and successful charter schools. I might also add that even though per pupil spending levels are already among the highest in the nation, Congress has nevertheless provided more funding for the public school system. But we need to do more. We must do something to help the thousands of children like the ones I've described today, whose future depends on getting out of failing schools. Not in 10 years, not in 5 years, but today. That's why I have introduced bipartisan legislation that would provide opportunity scholarships to low-income district residents. Under the legislation, which was introduced in the Senate by Senators Coates, Lieberman, and the chairman of this subcommittee, about 2,000 children would be eligible for a scholarship of up to $3,200. The scholarship could be used to attend the public, private, or religious school of the parents' choosing. It would also provide up to $500 in tutoring assistance to about 2,000 public school students. Not only will the scholarships give 2,000 children a chance to attend a better school immediately, it will also help improve the public schools. The only way the public school bureaucracy will be reformed is through the discipline and the accountability that competition will provide. Let me quote Howard Fuller, the former superintendent of Milwaukee's public schools. And I quote, "If you are in a system, as I was as a superintendent, demanding change, but everyone there is clear that whether a single child learns or not, everyone is going to get paid. If everybody is clear that in schools that have never educated kids each year, you are going to put more kids in there, there is not one single thing I can do about it. And all the rhetoric in the world is not going to change that. What I am saying is simply this. I think you have got to have a series of options for parents. I support charter schools. I support site-based management. That is real site-based management. I support anything that changes the options for parents. But I'm here to say that if one of these options is not choice, that gives poor parents a way to leave, the kind of pressure that you need internally is simply not going to occur. Mr. Chairman, in suburban neighborhoods, some pressures for positive change exist because middle-class families have the resources to take their children out of bad schools and put them into private schools. Thus, in a limited but important way, public schools are forced to compete for students. As a result, they frequently overcome bureaucratic inertia and improve. According to a recent Washington Post article, a Bethesda public school strengthened its curriculum in order to woo back to public school private school students searching for a rigorous education experience. This is the dynamic we must create in Anacostia. I would like to address two concerns that have been raised about my legislation. Some critics of the legislation argue that the only students that private schools are interested in taking are the brightest and most privileged, not the low-income students who are eligible for scholarships under the bill. A similar strain of this argument is that private schools, if they would accept poor children, would take only the brightest students and leave the public schools with the students who have the greatest needs. It is true that some exclusive schools like Sidwell Friends, where the president sent his child, only accept the best and the brightest. But under our legislation, the scholarships are awarded randomly to parents and students, not to the schools. Parents have the power to choose, not the schools. Parents can cherry-pick the best schools, not the other way around. Most importantly, this argument ignores what is really happening in this city. The 6 children from the family I mentioned earlier in my testimony were all accepted by a Catholic school in Anacostia, even though most are testing below grade level. I went to visit Holy Redeemer Catholic School, which is located near North Capitol Street. The school is serving the same low-income minority student population that attend the public schools. Same is true for the Nanny Helen Burroughs School that Senators Coates and Lieberman visited. These schools aren't exclusive. They are not institutions in the posh neighborhoods of Northwest Washington. I challenge school choice opponents to look beyond the schools where they are sending their own children and look to the dozens of schools in poor neighborhoods that are currently serving low-income, primarily African-American students. The entire mission of these schools is to serve the disadvantaged students that live in the poor neighborhoods in which they are located. Moreover, low-income students are already attending more than 60 area schools through scholarships provided by the Washington Scholarship Fund. In fact, many of Washington's most exclusive private schools have accepted poor students who are eligible for the scholarships. The Washington Scholarship Fund, which currently serves about 250 children, has a waiting list of several hundred children. The waiting list of the Washington Scholarship Fund leads me to another concern I hear expressed about the scholarship legislation, whether Congress would infringe on the district's home rule by providing opportunity scholarships. The number of children on the Washington Scholarship Fund's waiting list demonstrates that people of Washington, D.C. themselves want alternatives to the failing public schools. That support is reflected in the polling data. A recent poll shows that by a 44 to 31 margin, district residents believe providing scholarships to low-income children is a good use of taxpayer dollars. Among families earning less than $25,000, 59% support the program, while just 17% oppose it. African Americans support the idea by a 48 to 29 margin. Opposition to scholarships is highest among families who earn $60,000 or more, most of whom already send their children to private schools. Mr. Chairman, let me close by returning to the family I discussed in the opening of my statement. A child who goes through school without learning has the odds stacked against him. Most children who go through school without learning become grim statistics. We can't stand by and let that happen to another generation of children in our nation's capital. Every child in America deserves a safe, quality education and a fair chance at the American dream. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me just make a final personal observation. As you know, my home is Dallas, Texas. I do not live in Washington, D.C. I have never lived in Washington, D.C. I will never live in Washington, D.C. My grandchildren will not be raised in Washington, D.C. You could ask, why do I trouble myself over this question? And I can tell you, Mr. Chairman, it is not out of a concern for Washington, D.C. But Washington, D.C. is a city that has many very, very beautiful and very precious children. And it is just simply not something to be ignored. Each and every one of us that have the privilege of working in this city must be willing to look into this city and at least look into the eyes of these children. And anybody that works in this place, in this hill, in this town, who looks into those beautiful brown eyes and can say something other than, you must have your chance now. You cannot be required to wait until a system reforms itself. You cannot be allowed to be passed over by a system slow in reforming itself. It's failing in its duty to those children. And I must say that I believe that our duty to those children is larger than our duty to this city or our own home city, wherever it is. And it is, in fact, I think, the closest thing to a moral imperative that any of us face in this town. And I would invite anybody who thinks somehow or another the system may be troubled by this kind of an initiative to look beyond the system and to go look to one of these children. And if you can get by that little third grader who happened to be in my office the other day, if you can spend a half an hour with that little guy, and if you can come away without him owning you in some way, then your heart's too cold to work in this city or any place else. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Army. I appreciate very much your testifying and being here. You know, and it seems to me it is about the children, and it's also about making Washington, D.C. a shining example, which is what we're trying to do for it and for the children that go to school here. Let me ask you just, I guess, the most obvious of questions. Why is it that with the numbers of members of Congress that send their children to private school and have the income and the wherewithal to do that, with the statistics you cited of the failings of this school, this system towards the children, and with the advantages of these scholarships, why, and its bipartisan support for this. As you noted that Senator Lieberman, that's also on this panel, introduced this same companion legislation here. Why is there resistance to either these scholarships or even to the concept of vouchers? I mean, it seems to me that the whole situation would say that this is the clear answer in the way that we need to go.
Well, you know, I'm frustrated by that, too. Of course, strikes me that in politics, sophistry and power are all too often compelling influences in the lives of people who are at work. You know, I mean, I look at one of these little third graders. I don't think that they're particularly enamored with the esoteric formulations of some Supreme Court constitutional theory. They want to know, you know, can I go to a school where I'll be happy and safe, and can I have my bright eyes lit up by the excitement of learning? I think we all too often don't get beyond ourselves in this city. And as much as I believe that public choice and family choice and the involvement that I see in the parents, I mean, I met with some parents the other night, and I have to tell you, some of these parents are just incredible the way that they reach out beyond themselves for these children. You know, the scholarship fund provides about half the monies, and an awful lot of parents who have all they can do to just stay up with their current needs find a way to reach beyond that and provide the other half. It is a precious part of the solution, but in the main, the solution is to fix the entire D.C. school system. I think public choice is part of that process. I think competition helps. I think once the school system knows that I don't have an automatic command control over who all will fill my halls, whether they're winning or losing here, they will in fact reach out, as a school in Maryland I cited said, and find a way to encourage people to come back by demonstrating greater success. So I don't want to understate the importance of public school public school choice or school choice in terms of the encouragement it gives the public schools to get better, and in the end, the improvement of the overall performance of the public schools is what must be done. I think General Becton is committed to this. We visited about this, and while school choice is a precious part of the answer, it is not the whole answer. But we have an obligation to be open, have our eyes open to all the answers, all parts of the answers that can be there.
General Becton raised a question about the scholarship proposal, suggesting that his big concern is a lack of accountability in a scholarship type of system. Do you have concerns about that on the legislation, whether there's going to be sufficient accountability if some of these scholarships are used for private institutions?
No, I don't have any concerns about that. We have a school system here in this city that has got to be understood to be very likely the most tragic failure of any school system any place in America. I don't think anybody's sitting around worrying themselves about the lack of accountability of this system. This system has gone on too many years without people worrying about accountability. I have been to these schools. I've seen these children. I've seen people that have taken resources that are as little sometimes as a third of the per-child resources, and they've turned on these children to learn. And I sat in this one school, and grade after grade after grade, I asked the children, what's your favorite subject? And grade after grade after grade, they said science and math, science and math. I defy you to go into any public school in America and find the majority of children in the school saying their favorite subject at the third grade is science and math. I think people who worry about a lack of accountability ought to visit the schools. Look at the children. See the excitement in their young faces. And see the dedication of those teachers. I've said it before and I'll say it again. There is absolutely nothing more precious than a dedicated, loving teacher. And that's what you find here. These people are generally teaching and working at salaries that are considerably less than they can. And they're in it for the love. And for us to to think that an abstraction like accountability should negate a recognition of their good works, I think, is a failure on our part to, in fact, do the job that we need to go out and see for ourselves.
Thank you very much for being here with us today and for sponsoring this legislation and suggesting that you be putting it in the appropriations bill coming through the House. There'll be similar efforts on the Senate side to do that as well. I think it's important legislation to move forward. Thanks for your leadership, Majority Leader Army.
Thank you. I might add, I've talked to the subcommittee on appropriations that has jurisdiction over the city, and I am very confident. I believe they will, in fact, have this legislation in the House. As you know, both the chairman of that subcommittee and the ranking Democrat on the subcommittee are both in support of the legislation. So I think we will have it properly placed in the legislative process, and I think as we gain public recognition and understanding of the value of this in the lives of the children, we'll be able to take ourselves beyond the needs of systems and institutions and get to the ground we must stand on. I thank you again for holding these hearings.
And I might note, too, that it actually may well save money, even though this is in addition to the current public education. The scholarship is $3,500 versus $7,000 plus that the public education system spends. So it's not taking money out of the public education system, and it actually may cost less in delivering a better education for these children.
I believe that's right on a per capita basis. By the same token, I have encouraged the subcommittee, and I think the subcommittee is fully committed to the proposition that whatever funds are made available for this scholarship program in D.C. should not be gained by reducing funds available to the D.C. public school system. While we hold so close to our heart the importance that this can be in the number of children that benefit from it, I think we should never lose sight of the fact that the larger test, the more important thing for the greatest comprehensive care of all the children of the city is the rehabilitation of the D.C. public school system so that it performs at such a level. I think the competition engendered by choice helps in that process, and I don't want to see this choice program funded by reductions in revenues for the D.C. schools themselves. I don't think that'll be the case.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate your coming. The second panel will be Jeannie Allen, President of the Center for Education Reform, Nina Chakra, Education Policy Analyst, Domestic Policy Studies Heritage Foundation, and Kent Amos, President of the Urban Family Institute. And we certainly appreciate all three of you coming to testify today. What I'd like to do, if I could, with each of you is to have your full testimony put into the record. If you can summarize your statement, and then let's have a good interaction, if we can, back and forth, and even amongst some of the panelists. If you hear comments from the other panelists that you would like to react to, please feel free to do that. Have you agreed upon any order of presentation, or is there any needs that individuals have to testify first? Because otherwise I'll just go down the order that I called you in. Seeing no agreement, I'll come down the order that you've been called on. So Ms. Allen, the President for Center for Education Reform, very much appreciate you being here today, and the microphone, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate
Welcome back, I might
coming
say.
today. Thank you. First, I want to say I applaud Congressman Army for his sentiment and his passion over this issue. He, like Congressman Flake and hundreds of lawmakers across the country, both Democrat, Republican, and in between, embraced the very concept that he came here to talk to you about. And in fact, preliminary results from the Center's 1997 poll, which will be released next week, indicate 86% support among African Americans alone for some sort of school choice option that includes private schools. It's clear the time has come, and I'm delighted that you focused on the issue. I came back today, though, having been here 6 months ago, to primarily focus on the quest for charter schools in the district and related issues the district has been grappling with. I have to say that the effort remains slow and unencumbered, but what I see is bureaucratic foot dragging. I think there's a lack of clear vision of what the officials in charge think about what charters can do for D.C. school children. I believe it's still looking being looked at and approached very much as an aside, a fad, an additional thing, as opposed to what it's being considered across the country, which is a reinvigoration of public education, the opportunity for real people, teachers and parents and civic leaders, to create schools responsive to their needs and communities and make that part of, and as I said, sort of the re-revolutionizing of the public education system. In the city, no less than 4 major business and civic groups have been working full-time to clear hurdles and set positive signs of encouragement throughout the city. For an area with the 3rd strongest law in the land, the dearth of charter applicants in action to me is appalling, and I certainly don't think it was Congress's intent. Meanwhile, Chicago, which is not 2 hours away by plane, was plagued with problems one could consider worse than the districts. There, major legislation replaced the ineffective school board with a CEO and board of trustees and gave them 4 years to turn around a city where the dropout rate hovers around 50%. Chronic truancy in Chicago is 2 times the state average. Not 2 years after the changes were made, already dramatic reforms and efforts are beginning to be realized. The new trustees have fired 12 principals from schools with poor academic results. They've reconstituted an entire 7 schools. Most of those people were asked to reapply. Most of them were not rehired back by the CEO in charge, Paul Vallis. Chicago trustees also began and recognized that reading problems, which Congressman Army also referred to in District of Columbia, were a direct result of a lack of traditional fundamental reading instruction. They pushed a back-to-basics effort that emphasized phonics. They also required homework in every grade. The higher the grade, the more homework, and social promotion is now prohibited. Any child not able to pass muster or be guaranteed a place, say, from 4th to 5th grade the following year was required to sit in summer school this year to make up deficiencies, and I'm told progress was enormous this summer given the concentration and the focus and the fact that those people teaching summer school and those children going there knew that if they did not pass what was required of them, they would not have that grade to go into in the coming year. Serious accountability is being done and taken in Chicago, and it's something that I think we could learn a great deal from there. And I refer to several other incidences and effects of the Chicago Reform Act in my testimony. Chicago also has charter schools, as Illinois passed the law the same year D.C. did. There, Chicago has already authorized 10 of the 15 charter laws permitted by law. There's a cap there. And those schools range from schools for dropout rates, although the CEO of the Chicago schools, Paul Vallis, has also instituted 26 new alternative schools for troubled school children. So in addition to those schools, there are international baccalaureate and very high challenging curriculum for children in the city of Chicago through charter schools. There are some back-to-basic schools. There are some vocational schools. There's a panoply of very strong and encouraging charter schools that we're going to be following with great interest. One of the things that Vallis also didn't shy away from was trying to use the Catholic schools there as a template to follow. And making no bones about it, he said that he wanted to practice the tried and true practices the Catholic schools there were doing, using tests and standards as a benchmark. Over the last 2 years, there has been significant progress among both elementary and middle school children in reading and math. The progress is still, they have a lot of work to be done, but there's been significant point gains where for years there had been none. In Chicago, there were no delays in repairing dilapidated buildings. It was one of the first orders of businesses in 1995, and by 1996, many of the most serious safety infractions were fixed. Is it any wonder that the district the size of Chicago with 550 schools can make progress when it permits itself to hire any number of private contractors? In fact, private contracting was something Vallis put on the top of the table when he first went in looking at maintenance and all the various things he had to do in the school system, from, as I said, maintenance to food service. It also pays its bills on time. He was willing to open up to people throughout the state. And as a result, the number of work orders completed in Chicago rose from over 1,000 in 1 year to 16,000 just last year. So they got their buildings up to speed. Just 6 months ago, I shared with you my frustration over the pace of already enacted school reform here. As an observer with a wide and deep knowledge of reforms at play throughout the country, I recommended that some timelines be established here for officials to carry out the intent of the charter law. I spoke of the unparalleled potential for dramatic improvement that charters are bringing to children everywhere. Yet while over 150,000 children started off to about 750 charter schools around the country just last week, the district still has only 4. 2 which are new, one of which should have been closed long ago, quite frankly, and one who has struggled for every penny and ounce of freedom otherwise guaranteed to the school director by law. An acquaintance I have to share with you who worked briefly at DCPS recently remarked to me that he had gone in as an avid defender of the system as is and left reluctantly endorsing full-scale vouchers. While I, for one, offer unconditional support for aiding low-income children with real choices, I'm not sure that drawing that support from an experience with an ineffective bureaucracy is how I'd like to find compatriots. For if that is the impact the Central District has on its bright-eyed employees, and it does so every day, how can it be assured that any reform, no matter how mandated, is followed and carried through? The D.C. Public Charter School Coalition has recommended several steps to Congress to ensure parity and equity for charter schools. I think their recommendations sound. As a result, I appended them to the testimony that you have. But I've gone further to suggest that Congress make further demands and squelch the ability of the board and the school system to suck the life out of this critical education reform. Otherwise, we'll be having the same conversation next year. As we've seen in countless other states, if the people controlling the purse are not advocates and are not charged with fulfilling the law with appropriate oversight, then little will be done to affect charter schools. The D.C. Public Charter School Coalition, for example, has been negotiating for 6 months on the definition of preference when it comes to facilities for charter schools. Why it takes 6 months to define what preference should mean when Congress's intent was relatively clear, to me this should be maybe several meetings within a month time span, get it over with and get it done with so people can have access to facilities. I think the main reason that DCPS is in this position, and there's hundreds of other stories I could share with you of foot dragging, is because they've been wedding to doing business as usual for too long. There's no incentives to push this, and as I said, I don't think there's a clear vision and a role of what charter schools can do for this city. Why did it take more than 6 months, for example, as you well know now, for one of the only 2 charter schools in D.C. to get a portion of the federal charter school grant money? If 2 or 3 people have to sign a check, to me that doesn't take 6 months. 6 months, countless meetings, media attention, constant badgering. Is this what we want for D.C. school children? In Chicago, the trustees have fully established, well-publicized timelines and goals. The legislature has assigned people to work hands-on with the trustees to offer support as well as hold accountable those now in power. Part of this is about, to be sure, personalities, but it is also having a set of fixed goals and sticking to them. You cannot turn around a city with the severe problems of D.C. without doing so. Among my recommendations as a result of my observations are the following: that you need to convene a congressional briefing session for the Public School Charter Board, General Beckton and staff, the Board of Trustees, and others that are critical to this reform, some of the agencies you mentioned earlier, Senator, that were to be helping in the charter after the Smithsonian and others, and have that briefing conducted by leaders of the dozen or so states where charter schools are prospering and flourishing. I just don't think people understand or quite frankly get it and what can be done here. Enact measures, requirements, and timelines similar to those that are paving the way for dramatic reform in Chicago. As I recommended in April, require 100% of per pupil funding to be dispersed early in the process so schools can get off and running by curriculum-trained teachers in the summer. For easy payments, Congress can make special allocations from prior year funding. It would not break the bank, and it certainly would not increase appropriations. Assign a senior-level congressional staff person to attend and monitor all charter school policy meetings and serve as a liaison with the civic resource groups. This person would ensure that the congressional intent of the law was being fulfilled, and the DCPS would know clearly that Congress was aware of its various moves. Finally, establish a separate state education agency for the district. The district is the only area in the country where the SEA and the local education agency are one. It puts a conflict of interest in place if they have to be one and the same in terms of funding, and they view everything as competition as a result. Please understand, I do not question the motivations or intention of General Beckton, the DCPS, or his staff. It is clear, however, that the priorities of DCPS are not consistent with fundamental education reform, and that foot-dragging and delays will continue on every education measure unless and until the control is reestablished. This is no doubt an issue for the Board of Trustees, but as Congress created the board, so too must Congress amend its plans if it fails to develop as originally enacted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Allen. That's very good and pointed testimony. I look forward to some questions to ask you about carrying out some of these items. I, too, am very frustrated. This was 6 months ago. It was April 17th. Much of your testimony then is similar to what it is now. I mean, why haven't we had more progress in moving forward on this? And perhaps it's time for us to set those specific timeline dates and just say this is the way it's going to be if you're not going to move forward on these proposals. Ms. Shokra, am I saying that correctly?
Shakrai.
Shakra. Did I get that right
Yes.
that time? Okay.
Yes.
Delighted to have you here, Education Policy Analyst with the Heritage Foundation. Thanks for joining us, and the
Thank
floor is
you.
yours.
Mr. Chairman, it is an honor to appear before you today to discuss reforms in the District of Columbia Public Schools. Much has happened since the D.C. Financial Control Board has appointed General Julius Beckton as superintendent of D.C. schools last November. The board has acted swiftly and efficiently with many of the dilemmas facing the D.C. schools system, specifically by stripping the D.C. school board of its power over budget and policy. But as with many one-size-fits-all solutions, General Beckton's solutions are bound to displease some people. This was particularly apparent when they swiftly voted on shutting down 11 D.C. public schools just a few months ago. Although a fiscally sound solution, it lacked one key component: parental input. Nearly 2 years ago, Congress enacted one of the strongest charter school laws in the country for D.C., yet the city has only managed to open 2. While the rest of the country, as Jeannie noted, is reaping the benefits of charter schools, the nation's capital, whose families could benefit the most, is lagging behind. The dismal state of D.C. public schools, coupled with the current decrepit state of its school buildings, which has caused a 3-week delay in opening this fall, the abundance of violence and drugs on the school grounds, and the vast but ineffective school bureaucracy has mobilized everyone from the president to Congress and local activists to find ways to fix the system quickly. Mr. Chairman, there are many elements to an effective solution to the D.C. school system's shortcomings. One is an overhaul of the public schools, especially their suffocating bureaucracy, which General Beckton has taken on and vowed to fix by the year 2000. Another is to incorporate competition by offering charter schools within the public system. An alternative, I hope, will flourish under the general's rule. But the best solution is to offer D.C.'s parents vouchers to send their children to the school of their choice, be they public, private, or parochial. The district currently allows parents to choose between public schools of their choice. We need to make sure that option is expanded to private and religious schools. This is crucial for 3 reasons. The first being that private schools, especially parochial schools, produce better results, especially in the inner cities. As shown in the Milwaukee and Cleveland school choice experiments and the numerous private scholarship programs around the country, low-income inner-city children are benefiting from school choice. Recent studies of the Milwaukee School Choice Program by Paul Peterson of Harvard University and Jay Green of the University of Houston, for instance, show that after attending the choice program in Milwaukee for 3 years, the gap in test scores between whites and minorities narrowed by 33 to 50%. This study was nearly replicated by Cecilia Rouse from from Princeton University, who found very similar results. Other studies also confirm the success of choice programs, especially in the Catholic school arena. The most important work in this area, as you know, was done by the late sociologist James Coleman of the University of Chicago, who found that Catholic school sophomores scored 10% higher in science, 12% higher in civics, 17 to 21% higher in math, reading, vocabulary than their public school counterparts. His study also showed that a child is more likely to attend school with a child of another race in a private school than in a public one, and that dropout rates are significantly lower in private schools than in public schools. Recent studies confirm Coleman's findings with an even higher degree of accuracy. William Evans and Robert Schwab from the University of Maryland, for instance, found that attending a Catholic high school raised the probability of finishing high school and entering college for inner-city children by 17 percentage points. A study by Derek Neal of the University of Chicago found that African-American and Hispanic students attending urban Catholic schools were more than twice as likely to graduate from college as their counterparts in public schools. They also found that 27% minority graduates who started college went on to graduate, compared with only 11% in urban public schools. Neal's study was just recently replicated by University of Oregon Professor David Figlio, who found again the exact same results. Finally, Caroline Hawksby from Harvard has found that competition from private schools increased academic achievement at both public and private schools. She found that greater private school competition raises the academic quality of the public schools, the wages of the teachers in the public schools, and high school graduation rates of public school students. Through choice, Hawksby concludes that both public and private school kids would increase the amount of time spent in school by about 2 years, while their math and reading test scores would improve by about 10%. She also noticed a wage increase later on in life of 14 percentage points. Another reason why school choice will make a tremendous change in D.C. is the fact that more dollars will actually reach the classrooms. The legislation that you have offered with your colleagues channels federal dollars in the most direct way to parents who then select a school of choice for their children. And finally, vouchers would save the public school money to use on public school students. According to a study, for instance, on the cost of private school education conducted by the Cato Institute, 67% of all private elementary and secondary schools charge $2,500 or less in tuition. The average tuition in private schools is only $3,116. This is half the national average of $6,857 to educate a student in the public school. In D.C., the per pupil cost is even higher. The last estimate I've seen is $8,841. Many think that number is even higher than that. The average cost of a Catholic school in D.C. is less than half that amount. The public schools involved in a school choice or voucher program can in turn use the extra space and money to benefit their students by managing the resources better or taking firmer action against unruly students. Mr. Chairman, school choice is the only reform mechanism that would offer D.C. schools immediate and measurable results, offering the parents of the District of Columbia choices through the traditional public education system. Beyond that traditional system, via charter schools and private schools, will ease the burden on the district's public schools while ultimately offering all children in D.C. a better education.
Thank you very much for that testimony, and I look forward to some questions and interactions from you as well. Mr. Amos, the president of the Urban Family Institute, thank you for joining us today. I appreciate it very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Brownback. First, I'd like to note that we will amend our written testimony because things have been very fluid in our area the last few hours, including last night's conversations that we think will be very positive toward this end. We each come...
If you would, Mr. Amos, pull that microphone up a little bit closer to you.
Is
a little
better?
Directional, and we need to,
okay.
get you right into it.
All right, how's that, sir?
That's very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyway, we have been able to, in the last several hours, have a conversation with a number of the city leaders around the question that we bring before you today, and that is the question of how is it that we're going to fund the charter schools that are going to come online in this city. We have become a part of the charter school movement by a particular route, which we'll come back to in a moment if time permits. But let me start with what we're asking you to support, and that is a changing of the funding stream on how we fund charter schools in the District of Columbia. And the reason for this request is that we believe that the one way we can really impact this system is to bring private capital to bear. My background is one from corporate America. Again, I'll comment on that later. But we have been able to put together a pot of money, fairly sizable, from the private sector that is willing to invest in the public schools in this district. Those dollars, therefore, have to be repaid. The funding that we currently receive does not include capital dollars. If you want to improve the school buildings in this city, bring the private sector heavily involved in it, and we believe we can and will do that. But to repay the loans associated with that effort, we would like to be able to share equally in the capital cost associated with that comes to the District of Columbia. In addition to that, each of the teachers that we want to bring into the charter schools that we will be presenting next year and beyond, we want to be able to be fully compensated as well, which includes their pension costs. The pensions, currently the formula does not provide for the pension dollars that flow to the District of Columbia to flow to charter schools. We would ask that that be amended also as well, and we believe that the city is going to move to do that. Thirdly, right now the funding structure is such that the funds are predicated on the previous year's enrollment. To the extent that charter schools are brand new, there's no previous school enrollment, and therefore you're still a year out from receiving funding. For a startup organization, the initial days are very important. Therefore, we would hope that we'd find some formula that will allow for those dollars to flow to the charter schools as well. We think that, we could use the September month, because actually the fiscal year starts in October. Just count who's there the first day, so to speak, and use that as your measurement. But if that doesn't work, we can find another format. We'll do it a lot as well. And finally, we asked that if at some point in time the adult ed programs in Washington, D.C. begin to be refunded, that charter schools also participate in those dollars. The truth of the matter is, our situation is such that all the children in our community are surrounded by, in many instances, adults who need the same kind of training that children do, because they have gone through these systems prior to their children and have not fully been developed as well. So therefore, adult ed is going to be at some point in time a very crucial element, and we'd like to combine that. So we're asking that you support what we believe will be an initiative by the District of Columbia leadership to in fact amend the existing district resolution to accommodate these things. If federal law would also follow that, we would be certainly appreciate it. I come to this hearing today, unlike many who have said it, I'm a fourth generation Washingtonian. My grandfather taught in the D.C. public schools for 47 years. My father graduated from the D.C. public school and became an attorney. My mother taught in the D.C. Public schools for 32 years. I'm a graduate of D.C. public schools, and in fact, 16 years ago, I came back to Washington, D.C. as a vice president of a Fortune 50 company and put my children in D.C. public schools. A lot of people suggested that that was not the wisest thing that a corporate executive could do at that time, and certainly today. But we felt it was important that we live up to the legacy of our public education system. We found very quickly, however, that choice that we made may have a negative impact on our children and our family. So we decided to do something about it. That something about it we did was, first of all, bring corporate resources to bear into the public system that our children found themselves in. We put, through my position in the company, we were able to put a computer lab in the school. We were able to put a summer jobs program in the school and surrounded the children around us. But it wasn't enough. We still found ourselves with children in our home who needed the kind of supports that only a family could provide, and a community that surrounded children could provide. So my wife and I decided to open up our home and our resources to the children who surrounded our family. Long story short, Senator, we adopted 87 children over a 16-year period, 11 of which we had as many as 25 kids in our home every single day for as many as 2 years.
That $500 per child tax credit would be a nice one for you.
Yeah, anytime, anywhere. So we've sent dozens of children to college, children who many people would have suggested would not have made it. We've seen a host of our children graduate from college and go on to receive secondary degrees. We have 11 with advanced degrees today. But I am also here as one who has seen his children reach those type of pinnacles, but I've also seen his 16-year-old son gunned down as he was heading to school. We've also been there when our 19-year-old son, who came home from his freshman year of college playing basketball on a local playground, stabbed to death in an argument over a basketball. We've also gone down to Norfolk State in our son's junior year and bring him home in a body bag because he was standing in front of a 7-Eleven. We've seen our children gunned down, stabbed to death, and in fact, a 16-year-old child of ours was hung on his 16th birthday because he wouldn't sell drugs. So the reason why I am here today as a parent, if you will, and the reason why I walked away from corporate America to now beg for a living running a small nonprofit organization is not because we are here trying to do something about school. We're trying to save our society and in many ways our soul. The question for us is not how do you structure a school or anything else, but how does a system as powerful as this one create the kind of carnage that's going on in our society, and we can do something different about it. So we dedicated ourselves to trying to figure out a way to change the system that is producing the kind of foolishness that's going on in this society today. And we believe we can do that. We believe that, as we did several years ago working with your colleagues in the Senate, in Senate 1138, with then Senators Danforth and Bradley, we put forth a bill at that time called the Community Schools Act. Why to use school buildings as a centering point for community life? In many communities, there is no centering point. And that piece of legislation went through, and we're still supporting that. Today, we're here supporting charter schools. Why? Because, again, it comes back to the same principle. How do we organize community around caregiving in a sufficient manner that children end up productive adults? That's the goal. Real simple. It's not hard. So what we said we would do is, okay, if we can find a way to use public buildings called schools as a part of the human development equation, how do you do it? We brought corporate America to bear. We now have, again, as I said earlier, a host of dollars available to us by the corporate community willing to spend on public schools if, in fact, they have control of the asset. And as any business interest, we have a way to repay that loan. We figure out we can, for about 2,000 to 3,000 kids, at $1,500 a child, which is basically what's coming down with the capital cost, we can be able to fund some $50 million worth of changes in the physical structures of the buildings that we're talking about. And that's where we want to go and use the corporate and the capital dollars to accomplish that. In addition to that, we are working not only with schools, but with families. For the last several years, we've been working in public housing. I know this is not the subject of the day, but you cannot talk about children who go to schools who come from public housing and not understand the environment they come in. The truth of the matter is they're only in school 10% of the time. 90% of the time they're out of a school. What happens to them there? And our argument is that we have to do something there as well. So working with then Secretary Cisneros, and now with HUD, we have figured out a way to bring education reform to public housing, tie that to public schools, surround that by other public assets, playgrounds, with also the faith community of church and other kinds of assets, building a continuum that sees to it that every single child, every single family has a developmental paradigm that produces the kind of outcome that we want. So I say in conclusion, Senator Brownback, that our ask is, no, our plea is one of a family who has seen pain and known joy, to somehow bring the full weight and power of this institution to bring the kind of joy to all families that we know is possible. If you support the leadership of this city in the transformational efforts that we are undertaking today, give us the financial wherewithal, the political support, and the intellectual capital that this city has available to it. We can then make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Amos, and thank you for your work. And those tragedies are just, I mean, my heart goes out to you on those. That's terrible to see. You know, it strikes me, what we're seeing take place here is that we're not allowing every life, every opportunity to succeed. I mean, if one wants to see, if you look at life as sacred, it needs to have every chance to succeed and to grow and to prosper, and that we're just not allowing that in this powerful system, as you described, Mr. Amos. And that's what we really want to get at fundamentally is what can we change in this system to allow that, you know, that beauty that's in each of those lives to be able to blossom as much as possible. And it seems like now we're crushing so many of them. I mean, that's, Mr. Amos, apparently has been your experience with it. You're strongly supportive of the charter school efforts to try to move that forward. Do you see other things we ought to be doing as well to grant those greater opportunities?
Yes, sir. Well, let me also just be clear about my support for charter schools. I believe that Generals Beckton and Williams and all are there, as I think Jeannie said, and I also believe Nina said, are there well-intentioned. We all are well-intentioned, but this system, if we wait until they do what they have to do, I think Mr. Army talked about his grandchildren. Well, my grandchildren will probably go to D.C. public schools. And I got a bunch of them, by the way. I got 22 of them. But the point is that at some point in time, we can't wait for the system to change itself. We have to move as expeditiously as we can. So I believe that the charter movement, I believe also providing, Nina, young people and their families with enough opportunity financially to go anywhere they can. I don't want to see a single child left behind if we don't have to. So if we can fund a child to go to another school while we build a better system, let's do it. But right now we have to change systemically. Again, Jeannie talked about the 750 charter schools in the country kids are going to. Well, it's 120,000 schools. We're not going to break this thing school by school. We have to build a systemic kind of change. What we have is an opportunity here in Washington, D.C. that's very, very unique, that we can put together a systemic movement between the charter schools. There are 50 closed school buildings in this city right now. We are proposing, for example, with our private resources, to acquire all 50 of them. And that gives us then a school base of 50 buildings. Then we will join, as we already have. We are working currently with a host of people who want to fill those buildings with new ideas, new ventures. We are prepared to do that. And we have been working now for several months at putting that network together. So we think that we can work with the system and provide for it, in many instances, changes that they can't do because we have more flexibility. So the combination of what they want to do and what we are currently doing together will bring rapid change and thereby save more children. I'm sorry.
Mr. Amos, on purchasing those 50 buildings and starting schools, are you being supported by the educational bureaucracy? Are you fighting it? How would you characterize your negotiations?
I think that's the last word that you said. I would characterize them as negotiations, sir.
Right.
I think we are in the process of trying to have everyone understand that collectively we win. Fighting does not win. That's a losing proposition. So I think, as I said, as recently as last night, speaking with the chairman of the District of Columbia City Council's Education Committee, and they have the ability to write at least a sense of the council resolution, talking last night with two members of the Financial Control Board for over an hour. Everyone is beginning to understand if we do this thing right, and together we can bring substantive change quickly. There's no reason why we can't, in the fall of '98, have a host of schools open and ready to go in first-class way.
How many should we target to be open in the fall of '98?
Well, our goal is anywhere from 5 to 12 schools. Now, I know
from your organization.
Well, it's not just our organization. It's a combination of organizations coming together, working together.
Ms. Allen, how many should we target of charter schools to have open a year from now?
20.
Minimum of 20, and you stated 4, and I heard differing testimony here, 2 or 4, but you stated 4, and 1 should be closed. Mm-hmm. I think that's pretty well documented on the problems that it has had. But you think 20 at a minimum with the physical properties available?
And as Mr. Amos, as Ken has told you, I mean, there's no dearth of people that want to do this. There is a lot of lack of information. There's not as many people out there who have stepped up to the plate as could be potentially quality candidates working with a variety of the resource groups around, quite frankly, because you don't really even want to get involved in a process that just looks like a bear. Gee, well, there's this application, there's that, and I hear the money's not coming, and I hear the special ed might not be there, and I hear, well, they had a problem getting their federal money, and suddenly you've got a great teacher out there who want to do something, and you've given that teacher no hope. Whereas if you look at communities where we've had charter schools in existence as much as 4 or 5 years in states like Minnesota, they've not only become schools for, say, 150 or 200 kids, they've become these great meccas of a community. The Urban League has gotten involved in an after-school program. There's before-school care by the YMCA. The civic groups have adopted them. I mean, suddenly people who've wanted to be able to have some input and guide children along have found an opportunity in so many cities through charter schools because there's no rules written saying, no, you can't. It's very open. And so to a large extent, while Kent's absolutely right, there's a much larger mission in terms of saving lives that people like he are directly involved in. The whole concept of education reform through both school choice and charter schools helps build back a community and give children hopes that those kids on the outs are wondering what they're missing inside, whereas right now the kids on the in are wondering what they're missing outside.
Well, and it looks like to me, too, as Congressman Army was talking about, this is a way of saving public education, and it gets fought so much. You, though, Ms. Allen, believe that the only way we really get at this is by setting specific timelines for certain accomplishments. You think that otherwise the system will slow roll and crush anybody that really wants to get aggressive on establishing charter schools.
That's my feeling, yes.
And you listed several specifics. Have you listed specifics in your testimony on what should be done by what timelines?
I have some I could amend, some that I have actually suggested and followed with from April that I could amend based on that.
I would appreciate it. And we can look back at your testimony in April again to see about putting those on forward. Let me ask you as well, in Chicago you noted a similar situation, if not worse, than the District of Columbia, and dramatic reform that took place in a short period of time. You mentioned the firing of 12 principals in the school system in Chicago. How many principals have been fired in the District of Columbia? Do you know?
3 or 4? Yeah, 3. I believe 3.
3 have been.
I think
Do you-
there were a lot of reassignments also.
Do you think there's been ample work done in the District of Columbia in these restructurings, or do you have any thoughts? This is separate and distinct from charter, but just from the operation of the current public school system.
You know, the complaint that often big city officials use, which for a long time has been very, very valid, is that, well, we can't really reconstitute a staff because we've got the union and we've got a collective bargaining contract that says X, Y, and Z, and if we dismiss staff, they'd end up somewhere else in the system, and so why do this? There's lots of excuses. Chicago, they've got a very strong union. Chicago Teachers Union is one of the strongest in the country. But the attitude of the trustees, and in fact the legislature, was you can be with us or you can be against us. If you're against us, we're going to profile you for just that. So get out of the way. We're going to move in. We're going to take care of this. And if you've got a problem because someone's got tenure but they're incompetent, why don't we sit down and talk about that in public? And so it was real clear from the very start. I mean, there were not words to that effect said specifically by Paul Vallis. I'm not putting words in his mouth, but it was clear all along. We have a job to do. If you're in the way, if you have a problem, come to the table and make sure it's clear to everybody what you're doing, because we're going to get rid of people who are not working for our kids. That attitude isn't here. That attitude is, well, we have these people and there's a separate evaluation. They've had several years, and it's almost piecemeal. It's place by
Here in the
place.
District of Columbia, it's too piecemeal.
Mm-hmm.
And
with a lack of standards, I'm sorry, but with a lack of standards and clear tests, which were also part of the original D.C. Education Reform Bill. I'm not sure where they stand right now. But with a lack of an overall set of good tests used with a high rigorous standard to assess where children stand, you'd be able to see pretty quickly what schools were falling down and which weren't, and you would have been able to close failing schools as opposed to some schools that were actually doing a darn good job with an assessment like that.
Do we know that in the District of Columbia? Do we have sufficient test scoring to know what schools are failing and which ones are succeeding?
I think you've got your basic standardized tests, norm reference tests that most cities have, but I don't think there's anything more specific where in Chicago, for example, Milwaukee, and New York, you've got specific reading, math, and science tests that are pegged to how much kids should know, as opposed to norm referenced how much everybody else is doing. A norm reference test simply gives you 50% of the people are above average, 50% are below. Based on that, DC test scores are pretty low. Based on other kind of criteria, what would it look like if you were supposed to be doing X in 4th grade in math, and children in 4th grade in math were tested, and we found out that, say, 40% weren't there, then people could get to work. That's what they did in Milwaukee. They recognized that less than half the kids could do basic math in 4th grade. And everybody got motivated and did something about it.
But you're saying we have not accumulated that same sort of
objective analysis.
Objective, right, clear, specific test data for the District of Columbia public school student.
I don't believe we have, no.
Ms. Seamus, did you want to respond on that?
No, Jeannie covered it very well.
Would you agree with her statement?
I would agree with it. I think that there is a certain amount of data that is beginning to be amassed, but unfortunately it's going to tell us exactly what Jeannie's saying. And I think that again, the system can only move so fast. And I guess what we're suggesting is that we have to help them move faster.
Well, it seems to me that the very first thing you have to have is objective data to know really what sort of steps and means and things you have to do. You've got to know what's the extent of the problem. As bad as it might seem, you got to know first what's the extent of the problem before you can get in and specifically start fighting it.
Well, I believe, Senator, that there is enough body of data to understand the gravity of the circumstance. I think that's fairly well documented. It may not be on an individualized school basis as it may need to be, but we have a fairly good handle on that. I would suggest the first thing that needs to be done is to pretty much believe that every child is capable, as again, Mr. Army talked about, looking into the eyes of these children, as I do every single day. I still see kids every single day and have for 16 years. And I know they're capable of something else, and we demand of those children to be capable of something else. And the question is, what paradigm do you put in place for that to take place? Kids in my home, for example, were all reading below level for the most part, just like it's been described here. Well, if you're reading below level, what do you have to do? First of all, you have to make sure there's a paradigm that gets you reading more. So in our house, for example, there was a minimum of 2 hours reading every night, period. That was a starting point. If you watch television, every hour of television you watch, you also had to read an hour. So if you did 2 hours of television, you got 4 hours of reading. And you got to do it the same night. Well,
And not at the same time.
no, and definitely not at the same time. What it ended up doing is people stopped watching television. I mean, the formula became real easy. But it also meant that I had to stay up later. And I had to read, too. Not you do it and I don't do it. I read more in the last 16 years than I did in the first 45 before that. But that's beside the point. The point is that you have to create the kind of environment. We can do the same thing in our schools. If schools are still operating on the same paradigm, as to get up, school start at 9 and end at 3, and do all the same things, well, you're not going to catch up. You're behind. So what we're suggesting is schools stay open later, open earlier, and that the adults in their lives also come there. By the way, some of those adults have gone through bad experiences in literally those same buildings. So if the adult in that child's life has gone to that exact same school, had the same experience, what makes them any more attractive to go back? Well, we have to change that to say when the adult comes back and the child comes back, there's a new day there. There's a new encouragement there. There's a new set of resources available to them within the same dollars. There's not new money here. We're talking about how do you allocate the dollars and the resources, and we believe we can do it. One of the things we told the principal of the high school where my kids went to school was, look, I want to make sure the school stays open later. And the argument was, well, we can't keep it open later because, somebody's going to vandalize the school. I said, give me a key. I'm pretty good at opening and unlocking doors, and I can lock it back up. He did. And we kept the buildings open later. Even if it meant just us being in there, and I would take the liability. So how do you create the kind of environment, I guess we're suggesting here, that creates the new learning paradigm for all of our children and their families?
Ms. Shawkrek, you testified supporting full-scale vouchers. And I would presume, would you support this small step forward on the scholarship program?
Absolutely.
Okay. Ms. Allen, do you support a full-scale voucher type of program for the District of Columbia?
Absolutely. I think anybody that within an income level that should have access to the public, private, or parochial school of their choice. Senator, let me just add briefly, too. Over the last several weeks, we've been meeting a number of parent and community-based, some church-based groups of people who have heard about this effort on the Hill and are very, very interested. And I've long known that parents do care and parents do get involved when asked. But I've really never hit home until these last few weeks when you see people who say, well, I'm on public assistance and they called me last week and told me my child's going to be special ed. And I don't know why, because he was good, doing well all year. She'd love to come tell her story to you, by the way. And all of a sudden they want me to do this. What am I supposed to do? They say I have to sign these papers and put him in a special ed class or he can't come back to school. She has nowhere to go. She has no help. She has no support. There are stories like this every day. It's just not fair.
Mr. Amos, do you support a full-scale voucher program for D.C. public schools?
Again, I would be like Jeannie. I think that there ought to be some economic question associated with it. And I think also it ought to be on a trial basis, candidly, until such time that we give the opportunity for the system to change itself. If it doesn't, then so be it. But I think that the system is moving toward change, and we ought to give that opportunity. At the same time, however, I think we ought to have some limited scholarship program, if you will, vouchers, if you will, that will allow children who are in need of that kind of education right now, while we go through our machinations, if you will, as adults to change the system. We shouldn't hold children back, so therefore I would have some limited support to that, yes.
Well, I thank you all for coming. I have to say I'm disappointed, not in your testimony, but that since April 17th, there hasn't been further progress made. This is a paramount issue for the District of Columbia, how we educate our children, and we just have to start making more progress. And we need to get all the facts on the table, and we need to move forward rapidly. We just cannot wait for a bureaucracy to crush more kids. And I hope that we can have some of you back here be willing to review the system in another 6 months to a year, and that your statements then at that time will be much more positive because we made much more change. And at the end, our objective always has to be able to stare in that child's face and say, I did everything I could to recognize you and to be able to give you every chance you have. So we'll look forward to continue to looking at the school system, and thank you very much for testifying.
Thank you.
Um,